So I'll give you sort of like the background why I'm interested in this, right? So I'm at Nexus. We're building a CKVM, or we built a CKVM. We're also building a blockchain. And so like you want to get high type security, right? So why we're building a CKVM? Well, we can prove everything, right? And you have very strong guarantees, cryptographic guarantees that, everything is going to be correct. Okay, now that doesn't protect a blockchain, right? Because you can also have forks, right? So you have these kind of consistency, safety problems, right? Where suddenly you have two branches. And both of those branches can be completely perfectly valid according to whatever conditions you place on the blockchain, right? So the problem is, how do we prevent that? So it's sort of like thinking about, well, it would be natural to sort of like try to maximize the safety of the blockchain as well. And so that's what I'm thinking through, and also like present some of these thoughts, and I'm hoping, to learn from you and get some feedback on that. Okay, so the setting is a proof of stake blockchain. So like the quasi-permissionless setting, so I'll assume that we have a group of participants. They sort of like register somehow with some type of ID. They will have some sort of stake. And this is sort of like how we constrain that it's just not anybody, right? And in general, well, we'll have some genesis block, right? And then we'll start creating blocks. And these participants, they will be issuing confirmations of those blocks. And if you pass some threshold, say 2/3 of the stake, then that is enough to finalize the block, okay? Doesn't matter too much which type of consensus protocol it is, just as long as there's some sort of like way to say, okay, now this block is final, and let's proceed to the next one. Okay, now it's well known that, if you then have more than 1/3 of the stake that wants to hold progress, then they can do that, right? They can just not issue confirmations, and you can't make any progress. And it's also well known that there's a safety issue if more than 1/3 of the stakeholders don't want to cause a fork, right? They might be able to sort of like split the vote of the remainder of the stake, right? And actually confirm two different branches. Okay, so right now it looks like for many of the protocols that are deployed, right, essentially that, well, if we have less than 1/3 of the stake that is acting badly, then we're good to go. Everything runs smoothly. And if it's more than 1/3, then we don't have liveness. We don't have safety. Okay, so and I'm a little sort of like I'm unhappy about that view for a couple of reasons. So first of all, I think we've inherited a lot of baggage, maybe from the cryptography discipline, maybe from also distributed systems that sort of like think of these systems in terms of some nodes, and then the nodes are corrupt or they are honest, right? And typically, I think the world is a lot more messy than that if you actually look at concrete nodes, and we don't have a lot of visibility into like who are these node providers and who are the stakeholders. So I kind of want to move to an analysis where we're more realistic about, what does that actually look like, and why would they behave in not think of them maybe as corrupt honest, but just more like, are they compliant with the protocol, and why should we believe that they're compliant with the protocol? Okay. There's also the issue that sometimes you do this with random sampling or something like that, depending on committee sizes, and probably what I have in my mind is sort of like modest size committees here, right? And then it can be pretty hard to ensure that, that you actually have only 1/3 that could be potentially corrupted, right? So the question is, okay, can we get something that is sort of like beyond that 1/3? Okay, and there's been a lot of thinking about this already in the community. And I kind of, one work I like is a recent one which presents this model of expensive to attack in the absence of collapse. Okay, so the thinking there is, okay, so of course, if we have, less than a third of the stakeholders which is non-compliant, then we're good to go, right? We have liveness, we have safety. Also, it's pretty clear that if we have more than 2/3 of the stake that is doing something non-compliant, then there's really not much we can do, right? I mean, they can make progress on any chain they want because they have more than 2/3, right? And they can also, create an unlimited number of branches and confirm all of that, right? So that we don't have safety either, right? So it's clear that if we have more than 2/3 of the nodes that are corrupt, then we just have a collapse, right? Everything goes really bad. So, but there's this gap in between, and the question is, in this paper is, okay, is there something we can do in this gap here, right? And what they do is really say, okay, let's try to analyze this from an incentive perspective, right? Let's do an economic analysis or game theoretic analysis and see if we can sort of like actually have some incentives for nodes to be compliant, even if we had more than a third of them that could potentially be non-compliant. Okay, I want to say that I think there's been a lot of thinking about this already, especially the Ethereum community, and also you can see sort of like implementations of the Ethereum protocol. So they present the paper as saying, okay, it sort of like justifies some of the existing design conditions. So I wouldn't say these are the first ones to come up with these ideas, but they're probably the first ones to formalize it. Okay, so what I want to do is I'll give sort of like an informal introduction to some of the ideas in this paper. I'm only doing a slice of it, so there's a lot of stuff that I'm not going to cover here, so I'm not going to give them justice, but it's like what we need for our purposes when we're thinking about a blockchain. And then I want to think about what are the consequences of this model. And so first of all, okay, so they do make some assumptions about the communication, okay? And they actually prove that you cannot get that without some sort of like assumptions about the communication model, okay? But it's sort of like, what is the best we can get, right? So they're going to make a synchrony assumption. Of course, if you have synchrony, everything becomes much easier. However, they're not going to assume that we just have synchrony at like super lightning speed, okay? So the idea is more like, let's do a protocol that can sort of like get us to fast finality potentially, but then let's use synchrony with a much longer delay to sort of like create a backup system if things go wrong, okay? So think of like, a protocol that runs sort of like on the order of seconds, right? And then you have synchrony at the order of minutes or days or whatever. Okay, so if you take that context, okay, so then what I want to do then, so like after presenting this model is I want to think then through what are the implications of that, right? Okay, so they're talking about it should be expensive to attack if we're not in this collapse situation where there are too many non-compliant nodes, okay? But the question is, okay, if it's expensive to attack, but you have to compare what is the gain of the attacker, right? And whether it still pays off or doesn't pay off, right? So like thinking through what are the economic throughput we can get through a blockchain under this assumption. Okay, I'll think a little about, some ideas of like how we can then increase this economic throughput. And basically the goal here is, well, we want to, we have some sort of like economic resource, right, in terms of the stake, and the question is how can we resource and leverage that resource to the best, right, so we get sort of like most throughput from that resource. Okay, and then finally I want to think a little about, so in these models we then need to sort of like if we sort of like can determine how much throughput can we get, say how much value can we have per block and still be safe, right? There's also this question of like, how do we know what the value in a block is? Because oftentimes, especially if you have a smart contract system, right, then the value is really in the application layer, and it may not even be visible to the consensus protocol, right? So there's a question of how do we make that visible, right? And one idea for this is to use insurance. Okay, so all of this is work in progress. I'm not claiming any of this to be original or something like that. So I'm here to learn. So if you sort of like know of things that are relevant and that I ought to know about, then I'll be very eager to hear that either during the talk. You feel free to ask questions or afterwards. Okay, so so the first question, I guess, is, okay, how can we hope to get some sort of like economic security, right? Well, the idea is that we have these stakeholders. If they cheat, we want to punish them, okay? And the question is, okay, how can we punish them? First of all, we should have some evidence against them, right? So the finalization rule should include that a stakeholder should never confirm two blocks on two different branches, right? And then if we ever see a stakeholder that has actually confirmed these kind of things, right? Well, we actually have some evidence against them, right? We can sort of like pick the signature that have on these two different blocks, right? And then pass to the common root, right? And we can say, hey, you actually cheated. So there's a smoking gun, okay? And that's one advantage that we have. Okay, and then the idea is, well, if we have this smoking gun, then we can punish them. And this is sort of like whether we have this fallback operation with this synchronicity assumption, right, that saves us because, sort of like the standard, we don't actually have a majority, right? We're not guaranteed that, right? So we can't do that with the standard consensus protocol, but then we can fall back to this synchronicity. And there's a lot of clever engineering of like, making sure that with synchronicity, you can actually disseminate, hey, I saw somebody was cheating, and then you can slash them and cut them out of the protocol. Okay, so I'll think of these stakeholders as having some stakes, okay? I'm now using here fractions of the total stake, right? So these fractions should sum to 1. We already know that if there's less than a third that are equivocating, then there's just no fork and we're good, right? But if there's more than a third, well, then we actually have some slashing evidence, right? And again, I don't care so much about what kind of consensus protocol or finalization protocol we use, as long as we can just make sure that there's undeniable evidence against anybody who's cheating. Okay? And because there's at least a third that has to equivocate, then we also, have a third of the total stake at risk, right? Which is something that we could potentially slash and fine. Okay, so that's sort of like the economic risk that they have, right? There's up to a third of the stake or more. Okay, and then the flip side of it is, okay, why, what can you gain with an attack, right? So and the model I'm thinking about here is double spending attack. Again, there are nuances here. One should think about, sort of like token prices and how they could be affected by attacks and so forth. But let me analyze this from sort of like a double spending attack perspective. Okay, so suppose there's a fork, okay? And at some point, and this is sort of like where we use the synchrony assumption, right? At some point, it would be detected there's a fork, right? And then you would stop the protocol and start to do some sort of remediation protocol and slash the offenders. Okay, the problem is that at this point, the attacker may already have received some goods and run away with that, right? So the question is, how much can they earn from this attack? Okay, so suppose, for instance, we have a chain reorganization, right? We detect that there's something wrong. We keep the bottom branch. We discard the top branch, right? And assume that the attacker has already these stakeholders that were non-compliant. They've already cashed out of this. Okay. So then they earn sort of like the value in this top chain, right? So namely those two last blocks. Okay. You can sort of like look at like the different thresholds, right? So if it's more than a third of the stakeholders that are non-compliant, they may actually double spend. If it's more than half, then could potentially triple spend and so forth, right? And once they cross the 2/3 threshold, right, then they can just create infinite change, right? So they can just splurge. So I'm going to focus here in this talk for simplicity just on sort of like the double spending attack. Okay, so from an attacker's perspective, right, then this attack is a bad deal. If you have like the value of the gain, so in this example, V2 and V3 is less than a third of the stake. Okay, because then the value is less than what will be slashed. Okay, and more generally, right, the synchrony gives us some sort of detection window. So the way I'm thinking about it is that there will be some number of blocks after which we are guaranteed that we will discover an attack. Okay, so in general, double spending is disincentivized if the sum of these values in these blocks is less than a third of the stake. Okay, now, of course, if I'm the receiver of a payment, I'm sort of like, do I like this chain or not? Should I send the goods, right? Then, or is it better to wait? You can always wait until synchronicity, right? And then you're guaranteed that things are good and there are no forks on the way. Okay, but you are, of course, only seeing one chain, right? You don't know this potential other chain that might appear. Okay, so the way to think about it is, okay, if I'm on this chain and this chain is discarded, then what would happen, right? And would that be a costly thing for the attacker? Okay, and we're safe against this kind of double spending attack. It would be sort of like bad deal for the attackers to get a discard of this chain, right? If the sum of the values is less than a third of the stake. Now, of course, I don't know these future blocks, what will be the value in those future blocks, right? So again, we'll have to make some sort of approximation. And what the approximation I would like to make is to say, okay, that should be some sort of like upper bound on the value that can be present in a block. And this should be sort of like part of the finalization protocol that we enforce that we're not going to exceed this value. Okay, so as an example, what are the consequences here, right? So for instance, if we have like 30 million at stake, okay, if we have a detection window of say 100, right, then you could sort of like compute that this maximum bound should be about 100K. Okay. And what it shows, I mean, I guess this example shows is that the expensive to attack absent collapse, right? It is quite sensitive to what is the size of this detection window, right? How many blocks that you're running, right? So in the presentation, they sort of like talk about, think of, the sort of like a consensus protocol that's sort of like finalizing at a second level. Think of the synchronicity as at a day, right? But there's almost 100,000 seconds in a day, right? So that would be like, a really large value that we're dividing with, and it would mean that there's very little economic capacity in the block. So, and of course, we want the economic capacity of every block to be as large as possible, so we get the most out of the blockchain. Okay, so in general, I do think that we can do quite a lot better, because in general, it's not like, there's always a third of the confirmations missing or something like that. I think in general, you have pretty close to 100% compliance under the normal circumstances. But it does point to a difference. Okay, so the idea here is that we actually want to go beyond 2/3 to confirm and finalize. Okay, so think of this as, okay, typically these protocols, when they talk about finalization, just say, okay, we have 2/3 Okay, now we're final. Let's move on and forget about anything else, right? And what I'm suggesting here is that, well, let's keep on adding confirmations because they still provide value, right? You're still putting more stake at risk when you're adding additional confirmations later on. Okay, and that way we sort of like free up more economic capacity in the blocks as we go along. Okay, so this is one way that we may be able to increase the economic capacity in the blockchain system. Okay, so the other thing I want to talk about is sort of like, then, okay, suppose we actually do see that, you know, there's been a safety violation, okay? We're slashing some evil, non-compliant stakeholders. What do we do? Okay, who should get that reward? Okay, and a proposal that I think several papers have made, right, is that we should sort of like one thing we should do is we should make sure that users are not losing out here. Okay, so in general, you know, we want to incentivize adoption and usage of the blockchain, right? So we should sort of like make sure that they are actually not losing with this, right? So the idea then conclude, so like what you derive from that is it would be nice to use the slashed value to pay compensation to those who have suffered a loss, right? So if we have like a branch and we're discarding that branch because it was another one we're keeping, okay, then we should use the slashed amount to pay compensation to those who were to have value at risk in that discarded branch. Okay, and once you get beyond so like that compensation, I think it also makes sense to sort of like incentivize the remaining stakeholders to actually detect and slash the non-compliant stakeholders, right? So it would also make sense to give them some incentive from the slashed value. Okay. In practice, one has to be a little careful about these incentives, right? So it would be natural, like from a security perspective, let's just slash the maximal amount, and then, you know, we have the maximum disincentive to cheat. There's an interesting observation in Ethereum, though, right? Which and they so sort of like derived from the history. Okay, what actually happens in practice? Okay, so there's some examples of like in Ethereum, there was really a stakeholder that sort of like double voted for two different branches, okay, for financial gain. Okay, but there are also examples where this happened by accident, right? Somebody had configured like a primary node and a backup node, so in case the primary node went down, right? And then accidentally now they were both voting, right? And you did double voting, right? And it's sort of like a little cruel to punish somebody for a bug, right? And it also, if we punish very harshly for bugs, right, then we also disincentivizing people to actually put up stake in the first place. So, and I really like the idea in Ethereum that they have is basically what they are trying to detect then, is this like a collision that's building or is it just an accident? So they slash more severely if it's many that are sort of like at the same time are misbehaving. Okay, so the problem now is, okay, how do we know what is the value at risk in a block, right? Because all the value may not be so like directly in the transactions, it may be all be in so like, say, the application layer. So the problem that's remaining is so like, how do we even know what is the value? How do we make that visible to the consensus protocol so it can cap and make sure that it is not including more transaction than this sort of like maximum value that it can handle per block? Okay. And an idea here is essentially to get the participants to declare that value themselves. Okay, so but you know, why would they even want to do that? And my thinking here is, okay, you know, you would want to declare that value so you can get sort of like compensation if you need it, right? So the question is, okay, what would be a reasonable kind of compensation to declare, right? So some examples, like if you're a merchant, you're receiving something, maybe you want some, if it turns out that this transaction is on a chain, a branch that is later discarded, right? Then maybe you want, you have some hassle of freaking out and clawing back merchandise and things like that. So you want to have sort of like handling fee for that, right? Maybe if you're a buyer, you're purchasing something, but it was actually a steal. It's like double the value to yourself, right? So again, maybe you want to have some sort of like insurance that if somehow this transaction and payment is cancelled, then you still get some sort of like insurance that corresponds to the real value to you. Okay. And the way I think this is the right way of thinking about what kind of compensation you should declare is essentially that this is sort of like an insurance question, right? This is like, I'll take out some insurance on the transaction. If it turns out that it's cancelled and discarded, right? Then, if I have high enough insurance, then I'm basically happy I'm like being paid for the fact that it was not included. Okay. Okay, so let me jump to the conclusion. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm still trying to follow. So your problem is that you want to know the value of the block, converted to, like, say, the chain's base currency, like for instance, ETH for Ethereum. But you have, let's say, your chain allows DeFi, and you have like a lot of different tokens that only an Oracle can provide price estimation for. So your suggestion would be that the nodes, the stakers become like oracles.
Right. So okay. So your question is, so like, what am I trying to how do I want to measure? Or I guess what is the unit in which I want to measure value, right? And I'm not thinking about oracles here. I am making an assumption that whatever, say, the currency of this chain here is stable enough over the detection window that it's not going to fluctuate wildly, and therefore that, when you're putting the transaction in, you'd essentially have like be able to estimate as a user, so like reasonably this is so like the pricing I want to put in there. Okay, I do think there's a lot of things one can explore, but exactly what these prices are, I do think that currency fluctuations are something that you need to think about as well, but it's also a little difficult to model. So this is how far I've got so far on that. Okay, another question.
So, if I understand correctly what you're suggesting, you are suggesting to put the maximum capacity on how much value can be in a block, so that your insurance fund can cover it in case.
Yeah.
Isn't it a problem for scalability and for having a much more transaction? We have a bottleneck here because we are doing on purpose. We are limiting the amount of value we can exchange.
Yeah. So I mean, I think you are very right that it is a limitation, and in particular, if it's a long detection window, or you also want to protect yourselves against many branches potentially, right? Then you're really squeezing down the economic capacity in one block, right? And you could ask, okay, then what do we do if it's like a big transaction that we want to make, right? And I guess my analogy would be so like to traditional finance also. What do we do in general, right? If it's a small transaction, you can just tap your credit card or something like that, and the transaction goes through. If you're purchasing a house, typically that's not the way you do it, right? You have to go, make this bank transaction, and it has to wait for a day or whatever to make sure that the money was there and so forth, right? And especially like in this model here, if you have some sort of like synchronicity assumption that, after a certain number of blocks, we are guaranteed everybody has seen everything. Basically, you can just wait if it's a long transaction. So the problem I'm really trying to solve is like, we also have lots of things where we just wanted to go through and we wanted to go through now. So, okay. I have another question, but let me just finish with the conclusion and then get back to the question, so to make sure I have the time, okay? Okay, so what we've seen, okay, so I do like the fact that there's sort of like a gap in between the 1/3 and 2/3 corruption threshold, where we can also do something where we can use economics and we get some reason to believe that we still have safety, and we can disincentivize forks. Okay, so that means that we can get this kind of fast consensus protocol. I was talking about the synchronicity, and actually if you look at the paper, they also show some impossibility results if you don't have that kind of assumption. So we do need that, okay? And then I do think it's, if you then go through the logical conclusion, you have to sort of like start thinking about what is the economic throughput that we can support. And I think there's quite a lot of change that so like only assume that that there's less than 1/3 that's corrupt, right? And then of course we don't need all these considerations. But if we want to really take this model seriously and believe that it gives us some safety, then we have to think about what is the throughput capacity on a per block basis. Okay, and then I think the best way we can get people to honestly declare, so like the value at risk, is essentially through an insurance mechanism. So think about it as like, I want this transaction to go through, but if you paid me this insurance, I would be even happier, right? Then you're made whole, even if something goes wrong. On the flip side, why don't people just declare large insurance amounts? Well, I would expect that we would also want, people to pay a fee for this insurance, right? I mean, really what we're saying now is we have a bottleneck, which is the economic capacity per block, and people should pay for usage of that economic capacity. So, okay, and Björn, you had a question?
Yes, I mean, if you take that thought further about like sort of linking the economic risk of a block to the stake, and like the insurance idea, so you could also think like, okay, so it's also like in the real financial world, like if you make one very big transaction that's considered then risky, right? If you do hedging or maybe split it up, like have partners, then the risk goes down. And you could do something similar here, right? You could say incentivize blocks that somehow hedge the overall risk that is generated by the block. And then this way you create more capacity in relation to the stake.
Yeah. Good point. Yeah.
Yeah, and do you plan to have delegated proof of stake in Nexus or in this setup?
So at Nexus we have not got so far. We're essentially what we want to do is we want to get something that doesn't have this, which is more vanilla first, and then we want to iterate over that. So this is.
I wanted to highlight an interesting blog post by John Adler on the topic of economic security on Celestia forum. So basically, he argues in set up delegated proof of stake, but also it kind of applies in proof of stake if you have Lido types of restaking. That basically economic security is not. I mean, it's quite a, let's say, spicy take. That economic security is not very meaningful because most of the tokens that are getting slashed are actually not validators tokens, but the users tokens who stake for this validator. And the kind of the computations you do go a bit out of the window because the validator actually gets some money for themselves, but the tokens that are slashed are not their own tokens. So I just wanted to say that it's a very interesting forum post. Maybe it's called governance.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah. Thanks for that comment. I think indeed this sort of like ties into the question of like what is actually how are these node providers operating and how the stakeholders are operating, right? And we need to sort of like think about that system. So I do think, okay, regardless of who gets slashed, right? At least we're making the users whole, right? Because they get their thing from the insurance, right? So the question is more like who's paying for that, right? And I guess the model right now is often that somebody says, I'll run a node and you know, I'll stake and you can sort of like support me and you can add some stake to this, right? So we get more voting power, right? Which is sort of like a sort of like a fairly passive way of doing it, right? And then indeed, then, you know, if they're evil, they can just, you know, break safety, right? And it's not their problem because it's somebody else's money. But I do think it creates a correct incentive, which is whoever is depositing their stake with somebody else should investigate who that somebody else is and whether they're trustworthy or not, right? Which is sort of like a little better than the current mechanism, which is just like, you know, anybody can run a node and join, right? Anybody who has stake, right? And you don't know anything about who is actually running these blockchains. At least here now we're placing some incentive from some participants to, hey, you better check it out, right? And they do have some choice. They could choose this staking provider or that staking provider or this third staking provider. So I think we could get sort of like to a system where there's sort of like more trustworthiness because people are careful about who they are staking with. Okay, thanks a lot, all of you, for your attention.